Hello and welcome to Film 2231 Indigenous Film. We are going to have the last lecture of part A of this course today, that is about how Indigenous filmmakers, contemporary Indigenous filmmakers, use mainstream genres. And we are focusing on mainstream horror movies this week. We have discussed in this course in the first couple of weeks one important issue for Indigenous artists was stereotypical, inauthentic representations of Indigenous nation in mainstream films historically, from Western films of John Ford, even um, silent films and documentary, like anthropological documentaries early on, until now. The image of Native North Americans were always stereotypical in mainstream media, including generic films. For this reason, and with the exception of animation, Indigenous artists were interested in more realist forms of representation rather than generic films that are usually known for their anti-realist qualities, specifically something like horror or science fiction. If you look at the history of visual art for Indigenous artists in Canada, you don't see much of realism. For example, in paintings, superficial use of color, absence of depth, and so on. But in cinema, they usually used documentaries or realist forms of representations because they always wanted to reverse that stereotypical representation and instead offer a real image, more authentic, more real experience of day-to-day lives of indigenous people. Another reason for this is economical. Mainstream producers were not interested in real image of indigenous people and indigenous community. So horror as a mainstream genre known as targeting teenage audiences was not something to be explored by indigenous artists. Government grants and financial supports usually were given by NFB or Channel 2 for documentaries and animation. So, for these two main reasons, usually indigenous artists were not present in the production of mainstream generic films such as horror or science fiction films. This has been changed in the last few days. The success of zombie film Blood Quantum that we are going to watch for this week shows that indigenous artists can also work and be successful within the popular culture, Tarantino kind of film aesthetic. Jeff Barnaby said that Romero's zombie films were among sources of inspiration to make this film. It is interesting to talk about a history of zombie film, specifically in relation to racial otherness and how this genre can always be used by filmmakers to criticize the idea of repression, the otherness, and what the monster represents in dominant white, heterosexual, patriarchal culture. So there was a critic by the name of Robin Wood who argued that horror movies are about the return of the repressed. And the repressed is coming back as a form of social nightmare for bourgeois patriarchal capitalism. And he talks about zombie films of the 70s and 80s, but it started with the release of Night of the Living Dead, how the idea of nuclear family, consumerism, militarism, and capitalism were represented in Romero's Living Dead series. But all these zombie films, they had direct relationship with the issue of race. Actually, zombie films did not start with Romero. So decades before that, there were zombie films such as I Walked with a Zombie or White Zombies. Those early zombie films, some I would say primitive zombie films, zombies were not actually cannibal. They were just slow-moving creatures controlled by someone, usually a white man. So they were a slave. So they were linked to the issue of slavery. From the 60s through the release of Romero's film, it is linked more to the oppression. So that history is still with racial otherness was there. So there is, if you see in this chart, there is the role of black character present in each of these films like with Night of the Living Dead, one of the first Hollywood films featuring its hero as a black character is the central figure, is the only one that we care about, is the outsider, not part of the nuclear family things. And it's the same thing with Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead. So each time black characters are representing something, a form of resistance. And sometimes the only person that the female character is linked to is the black character. Until Dire of the Dead, that there's a group of organized and intelligent blacks who are the only people who know how to survive and they can control the situation. So the whole survival thing, and you're seeing in this film by Barnaby, is reversed. And maybe because they had that history. So usually we know about 90% of native people in certain areas of Canada and other parts of the continent were died by the diseases that settlers brought. And now in this film by Barnaby, you can see the reversal of that, and it's going to be interesting how the movie is historically grounded, although it looks like just an ordinary zombie film made for popular forms of entertainment. The historical meaning of the film is very interesting, and we can discuss it in our class. If you are a fan of Romero's film, the end of Night of the Living Dead is always linked to this history of slavery, lynching, and the similarities of those grainy images with the images coming from newspapers in Alabama. So, all these I wanted to say that zombie films, particularly, and horror films, they have this history of being critical of the dominant white ruling class, and it's always shown as a form of resistance. You can see in this clip the leadership and centrality of the black zombie character in this rebel against the capitalist city in Land of the Dead. The black character that is linked to a working class uprising. And you see this sort of Trump Tower kind of thing on the opposite side of the fences. You can see the whole idea of marginalization. It reminds you of certain scenes that you can see in contemporary news. So now with knowing this background about horror movies, particularly zombie films, in terms of the criticism of capitalism and the dominant ideological systems. Now it's interesting to see how the idea of racial otherness in relation with indigenous communities is represented in Blood Quantum, Jeff Barnaby's film. Canadian horror films are different than those of mainstream Hollywood films in terms of representations of gender politics, monstrous figure, and the otherness in general. One of the most known horror films of 21st century, I mean, series of horror films, are the Ginger Snap series. And it's interesting that Ginger Snaps is specifically the prequel to it, is linking the monster's otherness, the werewolf, to something that is brought up by the settlers, by the clone is the colonial monster. And in this scene, you see the image of a native teenage girl who is shredded by these colonial monster, the werewolf. It's interesting how the image of the blood of a red indigenous girl against the white background, the snow, is reminiscence of Canadian flag. So this become the consequences of oppressive, good-mannered, polite settlers. Canadian film scholars Andre Louisel argues that are about more unpleasant aspects of our collective identities, hidden under this stereotypical idea of politeness. Another horror film scholar, Maury Leader, argues that in Canada, horror films are used specifically by Indigenous artists to narrativize the genocidal violence of Canadian nation. A feminist scholar, Alia Ahmed, is interested in mythological and folkloric figures of indigenous tales. Although those figures were absent for a while in Canadian horror films, contemporary horror films like Ginger Snap used such mythological figures as a way of subverting the complicated conventions, narrative conventions of Canadian horror films. For example, in Ginger Snaps, the Wendigo character is used in the service of gendered and racialized political subversions. Ginger Snaps Back portrays a desire for indigenous identity to challenge the North American audience's preference to deny the continent's colonial history. So, after watching Blood Quantum, I want you to pay attention to how this colonial encounter has been represented in Jeff Barnaby's zombie film. If you're a fan of Romero's zombie film, try to see how the discourse of us and them is represented in this film. There's a famous quote in one of Romero's film that the zombies are us. How the relationship between the racial otherness and the notion of survival is represented. To what degree the film is historically conscious. Think of ideas that we went through in this course, such as the other film that we watched about the residential school systems in Canada were played at. How is it related to the history of genocide, cultural genocide, linguistic genocide, and the whole idea of representation of First Nations in mainstream North American media? What symbolic elements are used? What's the significance of the bridge? How the minority politic is relevant to the film. And lastly, in terms of the reception, how native audiences and non-native audiences would perceive this film differently. Thank you.